The night sky over Normandy was a firestorm of tracer rounds and burning aircraft. It was June 6, 1944, and the men of the 101st Airborne Division were falling into hell. The jump lights had gone green too early. Anti-aircraft flak tore the formation apart, scattering paratroopers miles from their landing zones. Men tumbled into trees, rivers, rooftops, and enemy gunfire. Lieutenant Dick Winters, breathless and alone, hit the ground in a hedgerow outside a small French town whose name he didn't recognize. Around him, the darkness pulsed with chaos, cries, gunshots, explosions. A farmhouse burned nearby, its roof collapsing in sparks. Somewhere a cow screamed. Winters gathered his weapon, heart hammering, the smell of cordite thick in his lungs. He was supposed to be with Easy Company near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, securing the causeways to Utah Beach. But as he crept through the orchard, he realized the truth. He wasn't anywhere near the objective. Neither was anyone else. The entire company had been scattered across the countryside. The Germans were awake now, engines roaring, boots pounding. The invasion of Europe had begun, and the 101st Airborne had landed in the wrong town. When Lieutenant Dick Winters rolled over in the mud and unhooked his parachute harness, the first thing he saw was fire. The horizon to the east shimmered with it. Tracer rounds, burning barns, the glow of a world being set alight. It was 1:30 hours and the air still rang with the distant drumming of flak. The invasion had begun, but nothing about this felt like the plan. He was supposed to have landed near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont with the rest of Easy Company. 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles. Their objective: seize causeways leading from Utah Beach, hold them until the amphibious troops arrived at dawn, and block German reinforcements from moving toward the beaches. But the sky above Normandy had turned into chaos. Flak bursts blooming like black flowers, aircraft scattering, jump masters shouting to men to go, go, go as pilots dodged death. Now Winters lay in a ditch somewhere south of the Cotentin Peninsula, miles off target, surrounded by darkness and gunfire. He had no idea where his men were, or if any had survived. The sound of cowbells drifted from a nearby field. It was surreal, almost mocking. Winters checked his gear. Rifle intact, ammo pouches full, map case gone, radio smashed. The hedgerows were taller than he imagined, ancient walls of earth and thorn-dividing fields into a maze of shadows. He could smell damp soil and manure, hear the faint murmur of German voices beyond the trees. Every instinct told him to move. He crouched low and began crawling, counting breaths, every step a risk. A flare went up to the north. Green light cascading over the countryside, revealing parachutes caught in trees, bodies swinging like pale ghosts. One of them twitched. Winters ran. Easy. Easy Company? He whispered hoarsely, scanning the dark. No answer. He found a private tangled in his chute, gasping. Winters cut him free. Where's the drop zone? The man asked. Winters shook his head. You're looking at it. As they moved, more men emerged from the hedgerows, disoriented, silent, faces ghostly under the moonlight. Sergeant Lipton, Private Malarkey, a few others. No radios, no officers above Winters, no idea where the enemy was. We're all that's left, Winters said quietly. So we make it count. The plan was gone, but the mission wasn't. They needed to find and destroy a German battery reported near Brecourt Manor, whose guns threatened the beaches. First, though, they had to survive the night. The group slipped through fields and orchards, their parachutes snagging on branches, boots sinking in wet soil. Dogs barked in the distance. The air smelled of cordite and apple blossom, Normandy's strange perfume of life and war. A farmer's house loomed ahead, dark and silent. Winters signaled halt. He crept to the window, peered inside. A family huddled under the table, wide-eyed, terrified. The mother clutched a child. The father stared at Winters with both fear and something like recognition.
American?
He whispered. Winters nodded once. The man pointed down the road, whispering, Allemands, beaucoup Allemands, many Germans. Winters nodded again, pressed a finger to his lips, and slipped back into the dark. By 03 car, the small group had grown to about a dozen scattered men, some from Easy, some from other units of the 101st and even the 82nd Airborne. Rank didn't matter now. Survival did. The countryside was alive with confusion. Lost paratroopers, stray firefights, enemy patrols shouting in German, flares bursting like lightning. Somewhere to the west, the distant boom of naval guns rolled over the fields. Winters paused, listening. Every explosion felt closer. That's the fleet, he murmured. They're softening the beaches. Malarkey looked up. So we're late? We're alive, Winters said. That's what matters. They crossed a stream waist-deep and freezing, rifles held above their heads. On the far bank, they stumbled upon a crashed C-47 transport, its fuselage torn open, parachute silk fluttering like ghosts in the wind. The pilot was dead, still strapped to his seat, face pale under the moon. Winters gently closed his eyes. Let's move, he whispered. The group pressed on toward the faint sound of gunfire, toward whatever passed for a front line in this chaos. At dawn, the mist lifted, revealing the Normandy countryside in all its quiet, shattered beauty. Fields of wheat and poppy rolled toward distant church spires. Smoke curled from burning barns. The air smelled of rain and blood. Winters stopped on a rise and looked out. Below, through the hedgerows, he saw a small crossroads village. A stone church, a few houses, a German truck idling in the square. A sign read Le Grand Chemin. He pulled out a compass. According to the drop maps he could recall, they were nearly 5 miles from their intended drop zone. We're in the wrong town, Winters said flatly. No one knows we're here. Lipton frowned. Then what do we do? Winters looked at him. We win anyway. The first skirmish came minutes later. A German patrol, 6 men with MP40s, emerged from a hedgerow barely 30 yards away. Both sides froze. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then someone fired. Bullets ripped through leaves and dirt. Winters dove into a ditch, returned fire with his M1. Malarkey dropped one German. Another fell screaming into the brush. The rest fled toward the village, shouting for reinforcements. Winters yelled, "Move! Into the orchard!" They sprinted, ducking as bullets tore through branches. A grenade went off behind them, showering earth and bark. Lipton stumbled, his sleeve torn by shrapnel. I'm fine, he grunted, reloading. They reached cover, an old stone wall mine, and caught their breath. The firefight had lasted less than 2 minutes, but already the balance of the morning had changed. The Germans knew they were here. Winters assessed quickly. We hold here, he said. If we can't find our objective, we make this our objective. He sent scouts to both flanks. Through binoculars, he could see more movement in the village. Trucks unloading troops, a machine gun being set up in the church belfry. They think we're a whole company, he realized. That gave him an idea. Then let's act like one. He organized the men into fire teams, spreading them along the hedgerows. We hit them first, hit them hard, and make them think we've got hundreds. The men grinned through exhaustion. Improvisation was survival. At 0610, the 101st Airborne's Ghost Platoon attacked Le Grand Chemin. The assault was brutal and improvised. Grenades over walls, rifles snapping in bursts, the roar of a captured German MG-42 shaking the morning air. Villagers huddled in basements as battle tore through their streets. Winters led from the front, calm, precise, fearless. He moved like a man who'd done this 100 times, even though no one had ever done this before. Invading Europe from the sky. Move up, he shouted, darting between hedgerows. The Germans fired from windows, their machine gun hammering from the church tower. Winters spotted the muzzle flash, took aim, and fired a single shot. The gun went silent. Smoke and glass drifted from the bell tower like snow. By 08 the town was theirs. German survivors fled north, leaving behind bodies and abandoned weapons. The villagers emerged slowly, faces pale, eyes wide. An old man approached Winters, clutching a loaf of bread. Merci, monsieur. Merci, Winters nodded, barely hearing him. His men were exhausted, filthy, trembling. Set perimeter, he ordered softly. We're not done yet. As they dug in, a distant rumble grew louder, and engines. Not jeeps. Not friendly. Lipton looked up. Armor? Winters raised his binoculars. Down the road from Carentan, a column of German half-tracks was approaching. Perhaps a company's worth. Supported by infantry. Reinforcements. They're coming to take their town back, Winters said grimly. He thought fast. The captured MG-42s were set up at both ends of the square. Bazookas were scarce, but they had grenades, rifles, and courage. We hold as long as we can, Winters said. Then we vanish. The men nodded. Moments later, the half-tracks rolled into view. The lead vehicle hit a mine Winters had improvised with a German grenade under a fuel drum. It exploded, flipping the truck onto its side. The column halted. Winters shouted, "Now!" Machine guns roared. The square erupted in gunfire, the air filled with smoke, dust, and screaming metal. German soldiers scattered, returning fire from doorways and ditches. The 101st's ragged platoon fought like a full battalion. Every man fired until his barrel smoked, moved, reloaded, fired again. Grenades arced through the air like sparks. The second half-track caught fire. Winters reloaded calmly, shouting orders through the din. Keep them pinned. Aim low. For nearly 40 minutes the battle raged. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The surviving Germans withdrew, dragging their wounded, their vehicles burning behind them. The town of Le Grand Chemin was silent again except for the crackle of flames. The men of the 101st, and all 12 of them, had done the impossible. They had taken a town they weren't meant to reach, held it against superior forces, and in doing so, secured a key crossroads that would later allow American armor to advance inland from Utah Beach. Winters leaned against a wall, breathing hard, eyes glazed. Lipton approached. "Sir," he said quietly, "we weren't supposed to be here." Winters nodded. "Yeah," he said, wiping dirt from his face. "Tell that to history." When the first tanks of the 4th Infantry Division rolled through the town hours later, their commander stopped and stared at the sight. German vehicles smoking, paratroopers dirty and grinning. "You boys been busy," the officer said. Winters simply replied, "We got lost." That night, under a sky thick with smoke and stars, the survivors of Easy Company gathered in the courtyard of a ruined farmhouse. They shared what rations they had, cleaned their rifles, and sat in silence. The invasion had only begun, but in that wrong town, far from their orders, they had found something truer than any plan: the will to fight, to adapt, to win. Winters looked at his men, weary, young, fearless, and said softly, "If this is what being lost looks like, I'll take it." By the second day after the jump, the men of the 101st Airborne had learned to stop asking where they were supposed to be, and instead focused on where they were needed. The countryside of Normandy unfolded before them in a patchwork of smoke, mud, and confusion. Fields broken by ancient hedgerows that had seen centuries of peace, and were now carved with trenches and blood. Lieutenant Dick Winters woke before dawn in the ruins of a farmhouse on the edge of Le Grand Chemin. His uniform stiff with dirt, his boots soaked. The world outside was gray and still, save for the occasional distant thud of artillery. He could smell cordite and the faint sweetness of crushed apples. The night had been spent tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and waiting for the counterattack that never came. As he stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, he realized something unsettling. They weren't a platoon anymore. They were a symbol. The men who had fallen into the wrong town had held it. The line that was never meant to exist had somehow become the front. The first sign of daylight brought movement. Farmers emerging from cellars, French civilians carrying buckets of water and bread, their faces still pale from fear. An old woman crossed herself as she passed the paratroopers. Winters watched silently as one of the villagers approached. A young man, perhaps 19, his clothes tattered but his eyes defiant. "The Germans," he said in halting English, pointing south. "They come back. Trucks, many." Winters nodded. He'd been expecting that. "How far?" "1 hour, maybe less." Winters turned to his men. "We move now." They'd held this ground for 24 hours, longer than anyone expected. Now it was time to fall back toward Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and rejoin the rest of the 506th. But as they packed their gear and prepared to leave, Winters paused. The villagers were watching, the old woman, the young man, the children peering from doorways. If they left now, the Germans would return and these people would pay the price. He glanced at Lipton, then at the road stretching south where the low rumble of engines already echoed. "We stay," Winters said quietly. "We finish this." The men didn't argue. They were beyond orders now, running on instinct and loyalty. They took positions along the hedgerows, setting up captured MG-42s and digging shallow foxholes in the clay. The morning mist clung to the fields like a veil, and from it came the distant clatter of metal and boots. "Here they come," whispered Malarkey, his knuckles white around his rifle. Through the fog, German shapes emerged. Infantry moving cautiously, rifles raised, their officers shouting orders in clipped tones. Winters raised his binoculars. He counted at least 50, supported by 2 light-armored cars. Far too many for his dozen men, but retreat was not an option now. "Hold until you see them clear," Winters murmured. His voice was calm, but inside his heart pounded. The Germans advanced through the wheat field, unaware they were walking into the jaws of defiance. Then Winters gave the order. One word: fire. The hedgerows exploded. Rifles cracked, machine guns roared, grenades burst among the enemy ranks. German soldiers dropped, screaming, diving for cover. The lead car lurched as a bullet shattered its driver's faceplate, veering into a ditch. Chaos spread instantly. The paratroopers fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, shifting positions constantly. The MG-42 rattled like thunder, chewing through the wheat. A corporal from another unit, his name long forgotten, climbed onto the hood of the wrecked car and fired a bazooka at the second vehicle. It went up in a fireball, scattering bodies and flames. Winters shouted over the din, coordinating movements, his commands crisp despite the chaos. Left flank. Shift fire. Keep the pressure on. The battle lasted 15 minutes that felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, the Germans were in retreat again, their survivors melting back into the fog. The field was littered with bodies, twisted metal, and burning fuel. The smell of death and diesel hung heavy in the air. Winters stood slowly, lowering his rifle, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. "Cease fire," he said softly. Silence settled, broken only by the crackle of flames. They had done it again, outnumbered, outgunned, off-target, but victorious. Lipton approached, his face streaked with mud. "That's the second time we've beaten the odds," he said. Winters managed a tired smile. "Then let's make it a habit." By midday, reinforcements finally arrived. A patrol of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, equally lost, equally grim. Their lieutenant recognized Winters. "Easy company?" he asked, astonished. "We thought you were gone." Winters shook his head. "Not yet." Together they consolidated positions, forming an impromptu line stretching along the hedgerows. It wasn't much, barely 50 men across half a mile, but it was enough to hold until the main force advanced inland. For the first time, Winters allowed himself to exhale. The worst, he thought, might finally be over. But war has a way of punishing hope. At dusk, as the sun bled red over the horizon, the first shells fell. Mortars, precise and unrelenting, walked across their line. Earth erupted around them, shrapnel slicing through the evening air. Men dived into their holes, covering their heads as explosions tore trees apart. A shell landed near Winters, blowing him backward, ears ringing. He sat up dazed and saw the young Frenchman from that morning, the villager who'd warned them, lying face down in the mud. Winters crawled to him, turned him over, but it was too late. The boy's eyes were open, unblinking, his mouth filled with dirt. Winters closed them gently, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew the boy couldn't hear. The shelling stopped as suddenly as it began. Through the smoke came the sound of engines again, heavier this time. Tanks. The hedgerows shuddered as a Panzer IV rolled into view, its turret turning slowly like a predator sniffing for prey. The men froze. Their bazooka had one round left. "That's all we've got," Lipton said grimly. Winters nodded. "Then we make it count." He waited until the tank was close, too close, and before giving the signal. The gunner fired. The rocket slammed into the Panzer's tracks, blowing one apart. The tank slewed sideways, its turret swinging wildly. The men cheered, but the celebration was short-lived. The tank's main gun fired blind, the shell detonating against a hedgerow, killing two instantly. Winters felt the concussion in his bones. "Fall back," he shouted. "To the crossroads." They moved fast, dragging the wounded, ducking under branches. Behind them, the crippled tank burned, its ammunition cooking off in a series of violent pops. They reached the crossroads by nightfall, exhausted and bloodied. Reinforcements were still nowhere to be found. Winters looked around at his men, some limping, some bleeding, all silent. The hedgerows were dark now, the only light coming from the distant fires of Carrington. "We hold here," Winters said simply. "This is our line." No one questioned him. They dug in, setting watches, rationing ammunition. The night air was thick with mist and fear. Somewhere nearby, a cow lowed softly, unaware of the men crouched in the dirt with their rifles aimed into the dark. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps came from the road, soft, deliberate, too slow for Americans. Winters raised his hand. "Hold." The figures drew closer. German voices, a patrol. He waited until they were almost upon them, then whispered, "Now." The road erupted in muzzle flashes. The Germans didn't stand a chance. When the firing stopped, 6 bodies lay in the dirt. Winters exhaled slowly. The smell of gunpowder clung to his clothes like memory. When dawn broke, the mist revealed what they had accomplished. They had stopped 2 enemy advances, destroyed armor, and held ground no one had ordered them to take. They were still cut off from the main division. But word was spreading through the countryside, whispers among villagers and stray paratroopers about a handful of Americans who had landed in the wrong place and refused to die. To the people of Normandy, they were already legends. Later that day, a jeep finally arrived. Mud splattered, engine coughing. The driver wore the patch of the 4th Infantry Division. "Looking for Easy Company," he shouted. Winters stepped forward. "You found them," he said. The driver stared, amazed. "Sir, they said you were wiped out." Winters smiled faintly. "They were wrong. The jeep brought news. The beaches were secure, reinforcements were pouring in, and command wanted all stray units to regroup for the push toward Carentan. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. Before leaving, Winters walked back to the farmhouse where it had all begun. The villagers stood outside, waving small flags. The old woman who had crossed herself pressed a single red flower into his hand. "Pour la liberté," she said, "and for freedom." Winters nodded, his throat tight. "For all of us," he whispered. He turned, climbed into the jeep, and as they drove away, the sound of the engine faded into the low hum of history. That night, the men of Easy Company reached the outskirts of Carentan. The roads were lined with wreckage, burned tanks, broken wagons, the remains of the Airborne's baptism of fire. They set up camp in an orchard, the moonlight silver on their helmets. Winters sat apart from the others, cleaning his rifle, the flower still tucked in his pocket. He thought about the boy in the mud, the old woman's trembling hands, the sheer madness of surviving against all odds. The map said they had been lost, but in truth, they had found the war's truest purpose. Not to follow orders blindly, but to protect those who could not protect themselves. "Lost?" he murmured, almost smiling. "We were exactly where we needed to be." As the men drifted to sleep under the stars, the rumble of artillery rolled in the distance again. The road to Carentan awaited, and beyond it, the endless grind toward victory. But for now, in that stolen calm between battles, the wrong drop had become something extraordinary, a testament to courage, chaos, and the will to fight even when the world makes no sense at all. The road to Carentan was not paved with glory, but with mud, blood, and ghosts. It began before dawn on June 10, 1944, 4 days after the drop, when the remnants of the 101st Airborne Division assembled on a hedgerow-lined dirt track under a low, colorless sky. Lieutenant Dick Winters stood with his men, faces hollow from exhaustion, their boots soaked and their uniforms torn. Around them, the countryside steamed in the morning fog, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Ahead lay Carentan, a small Norman town sitting astride the only road that connected Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. Whoever controlled it would control the link between the 2 American beachheads. The Germans knew it. So did the men of Easy Company. To take Carentan was to stitch the invasion together. To fail was to split it apart. Winters glanced down the road, then at his men. "We move," he said simply. And so they did. 12 miles through fields and farms where every ditch could hide a sniper, and every window could hold death. They moved in silence, boots crunching on gravel, rifles ready, the hedgerows towering on either side like green walls. The air was thick with tension. Occasional bursts of gunfire cracked in the distance, and other units, other battles. A German aircraft droned overhead, distant but menacing. The men hugged the shadows. The countryside, once peaceful and idyllic, now felt like a trap laid by the devil himself. All beauty turned hostile. Winters led from the front, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, Lipton, Malarkey, Compton, and a dozen others trudged forward, mud caked to their legs, their faces streaked with grime. Somewhere far off, artillery thundered, the dull heartbeat of a continent at war. As the sun rose, they reached the outskirts of a small hamlet, Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Smoke curled from chimneys, but the village was eerily quiet. "Too quiet," Lipton muttered. Winters raised his hand, signaling halt. He moved forward with 2 men creeping along the hedgerow until he could see the main street. German helmets glinted in the distance. A machine gun nest. "Ambush," Winters whispered. They could try to flank it, but that would take time, and time was a luxury they didn't have. The orders from Colonel Sink were clear: reach Carentan before nightfall. Winters exhaled, then turned to his men. We take it fast and hard. The firefight that followed was short and vicious. Easy Company burst into the village like a storm, grenades sailing through windows, rifles cracking in tight bursts. The Germans fired back, bullets slicing through the morning mist. A shot tore through Private Muck's arm, spinning him to the ground. Lipton dragged him behind a wall, tying a tourniquet with one hand while firing with the other. Winters sprinted across the street, firing from the hip, shouting orders over the chaos. "Push through! Don't stop!" Within minutes it was over. The Germans had fled, leaving behind bodies and broken weapons. The paratroopers regrouped among the smoking ruins. A cow wandered aimlessly through the square, stepping over shell casings. War was absurd like that. Death and life tangled in the same frame. They pressed on, the road narrowing into a dirt lane choked with smoke. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud into a crust that cracked underfoot. Every man was running on fumes, no sleep, little food, and nerves stretched thin. By midday they reached the Douve River. The bridge that once spanned it was gone, blown apart by retreating Germans. The air reeked of burnt wood and rot. Dead cattle floated downstream. Winters cursed under his breath. They needed to cross to reach Carentan. "We'll find another way," he said. They moved upstream, wading through reeds until they found a narrow crossing, barely waist deep but wide enough to drown a man in full gear. Winters went first, his rifle held high, water up to his chest. The current tugged at his legs. On the far bank something flashed, a sniper. The shot cracked like thunder, grazing his helmet. He dove forward, landing hard in the mud. "Sniper, right bank!" Lipton shouted. The men fired back, bullets snapping through the trees. Then silence. The sniper was gone. Winters stood slowly, mud dripping from his helmet, and kept walking. On the other side, they found a farmhouse riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the floor was littered with German field rations and bloodied bandages. The house smelled of gun oil and decay. On the wall hung a crucifix, crooked but still standing. Malarkey stared at it for a long moment. "They were here just hours ago," he said. Winters nodded. "And they'll be waiting in Carentan." They rested briefly, refilling canteens, sharing the last of their rations. Stale biscuits, chocolate, a sip of coffee that tasted of rust. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of machine guns from the direction of the town. The battle had already begun. By late afternoon, they reached the ridgeline overlooking Carentan. The view was both breathtaking and terrible. The town lay below like a painting of ruin, smoke rising from shattered rooftops, church spire cracked and leaning. German forces, elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment, had turned it into a fortress with machine guns in every window and 88s hidden along the roads. The 501st and 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiments were already engaged on the outskirts, pinned down by withering fire. Winters studied the scene through his binoculars. "We go in from the west," he said. "Cut through the back streets. Stay low, no heroics," the men nodded. They knew what was coming. As dusk fell, Easy Company slipped into the outskirts. The streets were narrow, lined with stone houses that echoed every gunshot like a drum. The smell of cordite and smoke hung thick. They moved from doorway to doorway, clearing rooms one at a time. In one house, they found a young French girl hiding under a bed, clutching a doll. She stared at them with enormous eyes, too terrified to cry. Lipton knelt beside her, whispering, "It's okay. We're here." But even as he said it, bullets shattered the window. The girl screamed. Winters returned fire, dropping 2 Germans who had emerged from across the street. The noise was deafening, the flashes blinding in the gloom. They pressed onward, block by block, until they reached the town square. The square was a killing field. Machine guns raked it from 3 sides. The air vibrated with lead. Winters ducked behind a stone trough, bullets sparking off its edge. "We need that gun out," he shouted. A corporal crawled forward with a grenade, pulling the pin with his teeth. He tossed it through a shattered window. A flash, a scream, and then silence. Winters signaled advance. They sprinted across the square one by one, diving for cover as bullets snapped around them. A church bell, cracked by a previous shell, swayed and rang weakly, a ghostly echo over the carnage. By nightfall, they had taken half the town. Fires burned in every street, casting long shadows. The men were filthy, drenched in sweat and soot, but their eyes burned with purpose. Winters led them toward the last German stronghold, a stone warehouse near the rail yard. Inside, they could hear engines idling and voices shouting in German. "We flank them," Winters whispered. They moved quietly through the alley, every step measured. A dog barked once, then fell silent. When they were close enough to smell the diesel, Winters gave the signal. Grenades flew. The explosion shattered the night, followed by gunfire that seemed to last forever. When it ended, the warehouse was burning, and the Germans were gone. The next morning, Carentan belonged to the Americans. Smoke hung low over the town, mingling with the smell of rain and ash. Bodies lay in the streets, some German, some American, all silent now. The church bell finally fell from its tower with a hollow crash. Winters stood in the square, watching medics tend to the wounded, the sunlight pale and cold on his face. Lipton limped up beside him. "We did it," he said softly. Winters nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "We did what we had to." He looked around, at the destroyed homes, the shattered glass, the faces of civilians peering from the ruins. Victory here didn't look like triumph. It looked like survival. Later that day, General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st, arrived in a jeep. He stepped out, surveying the wreckage. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. Winters approached, saluting wearily. "Lieutenant Winters, Easy Company, sir." Taylor looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "You boys just opened the door to Normandy." Winters said nothing. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had lost too many friends in a town that would never know their names. That night, the men of Easy Company bivouacked on the edge of town. The rain began to fall and went soft at first, then steady. They sat under their ponchos, smoking quietly, each lost in his thoughts. Malarkey pulled out a letter from home, the paper smudged with dirt, and read it under the flickering light of a lantern. Lipton cleaned his rifle, his hands methodical despite the tremor in his fingers. Winters sat alone, writing in his notebook, coordinates, casualty counts, details of the mission. When he finished, he closed the book and stared into the rain. "We took Carentan," he whispered to himself. But at what cost? As the rain turned the dirt to mud again, thunder rumbled in the distance, and not from the sky but from the east. Artillery. The war was moving on. The road behind them was littered with ghosts. The road ahead no less dangerous. But in that moment, as the 101st held the ruined town between the beaches, something profound had shifted. They were no longer lost paratroopers scattered by fate. They were the line, the living bridge between two armies, between chaos and conquest, between the beginning of D-Day and the long march to Berlin. And as dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Carentan, the screaming eagles stood together, drenched, exhausted, and unbreakable. The morning after the fall of Carentan began with silence, but it was the kind of silence that trembles, heavy, electric, waiting to be broken. The 101st Airborne Division had taken the town at a terrible cost, and now the men of Easy Company lay among the rubble like ghosts who hadn't yet realized they were still alive. The rain had stopped in the night, leaving a film of mist clinging to the broken rooftops and craters. Every street smelled of wet plaster, diesel, and death. Lieutenant Dick Winters sat on the steps of a bombed-out house, helmet in his hands, eyes unfocused. Across the square, medics moved through the ruins with litters, collecting the wounded. Somewhere, a phonograph played faintly, a warped French melody drifting through shattered glass. To the west, artillery rumbled again, low and steady. The Germans weren't finished. Intelligence said they were regrouping, elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, elite troops from Brittany, preparing a counterattack. Carentan had been taken, but holding it would test the airborne soul. By midday, the clouds had lifted, revealing a blue sky that felt almost cruel. The town's main square was a fortress now. Sandbags stacked behind windows, machine guns positioned at every approach, mines and tripwires laced through the alleys. Winters moved through the defenses, checking on his men. They were hollow-eyed, some bandaged, all exhausted. "You get some sleep yet?" he asked Lipton, who shook his head, reloading magazines instead. "Sleep's a luxury," Lipton said with a half-smile. Winters nodded. "Then we'll make do without it." Around them, the remnants of Easy Company were spread thin, barely 60 men holding ground that should have taken 2 battalions. But retreat was unthinkable. Carentan was the hinge between the beaches. If it fell, the invasion could unravel. At 14 hours, scouts reported movement south of town. Trucks, armor, infantry columns. Winters climbed the church tower, its bell gone, its spire cracked from artillery. From there he saw them, a line of black dots moving through the fields, tanks, half-tracks, motorcycles. The SS Panzer Grenadiers had come. He climbed down, landing hard on his boots. "Positions!" he shouted. Men scrambled to posts, fingers trembling as they chambered rounds. The calm before battle was worse than battle itself, a waiting that gnawed at the mind. The sound reached them first, engines growling, tracks grinding against dirt, the low chant of enemy soldiers. Winters checked his watch. "Any minute now," he murmured. Then the first shells hit. The opening salvo tore through the town like thunder. Buildings collapsed in plumes of dust. Shrapnel whirled through the air. Men dove for cover, ears ringing. Winters pressed himself against a wall, feeling it tremble with each explosion. "They're walking it in," someone yelled. The Germans were shelling systematically, creeping their barrage closer with each minute. Then the tanks came, gray beasts crawling through the smoke, MG-42s spitting fire. The 101st responded in kind. Bazookas fired from doorways. Rifle grenades arced over rooftops. The air filled with a deafening roar, gunfire, shouting, the hiss of burning fuel. Winters shouted orders through the chaos. "Hold your fire until they're close. Make them pay for every inch." He dashed across the street, bullets snapping past, dragging a wounded paratrooper into cover. "You're fine, soldier," he said, pressing a hand over the man's wound, though his voice trembled. "You'll make it." For 3 hours, the battle for Carentan became a nightmare painted in black smoke and blood. German infantry surged through the outskirts, firing from every direction. Winters coordinated defense from a crumbled wall near the square, his face streaked with grime, his voice raw. When one of the tanks broke through, crushing a barricade, Private Popeye Wynne charged with a satchel charge, diving under the treads as it fired point blank. The explosion lifted the tank onto its side. The shockwave flattened everyone nearby. When the dust cleared, Wynne was gone, his body lost under the wreckage, but the tank was silent. The men fought harder after that, not for the plan, not for the beaches, but for each other. By late afternoon, the square was a furnace. Ammunition was running low, water nearly gone, and the wounded filled every doorway. The enemy pressed closer, SS troops using the hedgerows as cover. Winters knew they couldn't hold much longer. "We need armor," he told Lipton. "Or we're done." Lipton nodded grimly. Radio contact was spotty, but somewhere beyond the horizon, the 2nd Armored Division was supposed to be advancing from Omaha Beach. If they didn't arrive soon, Easy Company would be overrun. Winters grabbed the radio, static hissing in his ear. "Thunder. This is Easy. Carentan under heavy assault. We're at the breaking point, over." No reply, only the sound of battle. He slammed the receiver down, swore under his breath, then turned to his men. "We hold," he said again, though even he didn't believe it this time. As the sun dipped low, the Germans launched one final push, hundreds of infantry pouring across the fields, machine guns blazing, mortars whistling overhead. The 101st fired until their barrels smoked, the recoil bruising their shoulders. The line wavered, men fell. Then, just as the first enemy soldiers breached the square, a new sound cut through the chaos. Deep, metallic, unmistakable. Engines. But these weren't German. From the North Road came the rumble of Sherman tanks. The 2nd Armored had arrived. Their guns opened fire instantly, shells slamming into the enemy ranks, throwing dirt and bodies skyward. The Panzer Grenadiers faltered. Then they broke. In moments, the tide turned. Winters stood in the middle of the square, smoke swirling around him, watching the enemy retreat through the fields they'd entered hours before. The sound of their engines faded, replaced by the slow crackle of burning debris. Carentan was still American. The aftermath was quiet, eerily so. The sun set behind a horizon of smoke, painting the sky in streaks of orange and ash. The men of Easy Company slumped where they stood, too tired even to speak. Some wept openly, others stared into nothing, hollow with exhaustion and disbelief. Medics moved among them with morphine and bandages. Winters walked the line, his body aching, his mind empty. Everywhere he looked was ruin. Buildings flattened, corpses twisted in unnatural repose, the streets painted with mud and blood. But amid the destruction, something deeper pulsed, the sense that they had done something immortal. Later that night, Winters sat alone on a step outside the church, The same place he'd sat that morning. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from adrenaline leaving the body. He could still hear the echoes of the day, the screams, the explosions, the thud of tank shells. Lipton approached quietly, handing him a canteen. "You should rest," he said. Winters took a sip, nodded. "You ever think about why we're here?" he asked. Lipton looked around, ran at the rubble, the wounded, the silent town. "Every damn second," he said softly. Winters managed a faint smile. "Then maybe that's what keeps us human." At dawn, the first rays of light revealed what they had held against all odds. The town still stood, scarred but unbroken. Civilians emerged from cellars, some in tears, some clutching rosaries. An old man raised a tattered French flag over the church ruins. The men watched silently as it fluttered in the wind, torn but defiant. A photographer from the Stars and Stripes newspaper arrived, taking pictures of the scene. The paratroopers covered in grime, standing amid the wreckage like figures carved from history. When he lowered his camera, he said softly, "They'll never believe this back home." Winters looked at him. "Doesn't matter if they do," he said. "We were here." For the rest of that day, Easy Company buried their dead. They marked the graves with rifles and helmets, saying nothing. Each name written into the soil was a story cut short, a voice that would never return. The young ones died with their eyes open, the veterans with them closed. The ground was heavy with silence. Winters moved from cross to cross, memorizing faces, his heart turning to stone. He knew this was only the beginning. The war would demand more, much more. But something inside him hardened that morning. They would endure it, whatever came. They already had. That evening, as the men gathered around small fires, someone found a half-broken radio and tuned it until faint music drifted through. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The notes floated over the ruins like a ghost, soft and tender. For a moment, they weren't soldiers in a foreign town. They were just men, tired, scarred, dreaming of home. Lipton leaned back, eyes closed. "You think they'll remember this place?" he asked. Winters didn't answer right away. He stared at the French flag waving against the dying light, then said quietly, "They'll remember the men." The war didn't stop after Carentan. It merely changed shape. The days that followed were heavy and colorless, a gray mist that hung over the men of Easy Company like a shroud. The battle was won, but victory in war is a strange, hollow thing. It smells of smoke, dried blood, and the sour taste of ration coffee sipped beside the dead. Lieutenant Dick Winters woke every morning before dawn to the sound of boots on cobblestone and the distant rumble of artillery to the east. Normandy was not yet secure. The Germans were retreating but not beaten, their rearguard fighting for every field and hedgerow. The 101st Airborne had become the thread stitching the invasion together, and Carentan, the small town that no one was supposed to reach, was now the keystone of the Allied front. But to the men holding it, it was something simpler, a patch of earth where brothers bled together and refused to fall. Each day began the same, the sharp crack of gunfire, the whistle of incoming shells, and the metallic ring of shovels as men deepened their foxholes among the rubble. Winters walked the line quietly, boots crunching on broken glass, nodding to each man. He had grown thinner in those days, the sharpness of command etched into his face. Sergeant Lipton was always nearby, calm and dependable, a steady presence amid exhaustion. Malarkey, Compton, Liebgott. They joked less now, their humor dulled but not extinguished. Between firefights, they shared cigarettes, letters from home, and fragments of laughter that sounded like echoes of who they used to be. The townspeople brought what little they had, bread, wine, potatoes, offering them as gifts to the men they now called les libérateurs. The children followed them through the streets wide-eyed, tracing the wings on their shoulders. In the evenings, when the shelling stopped, the paratroopers would sit on the church steps, staring at the horizon that flickered with distant fire, and talk about anything but war. "You think anyone will believe this?" Malarkey asked once, exhaling smoke into the night. Winters looked up at the stars, faint through the haze. "Doesn't matter," he said softly. "We'll remember for them." But memory, like the war, was a double-edged blade. Every sound carried ghosts. The thump of boots down an alley, the echo of laughter turning suddenly into gunfire. They had lost too many friends in too few days, and every survivor carried the weight of those who hadn't made it. Private Blythe, once nervous and uncertain, now walked the streets with his rifle at the ready, eyes hard as flint. The transformation of boys into soldiers was not heroic. It was quiet, brutal, and irreversible. The chaplain came through once offering communion beside a burnt-out cafe. Half the men refused. Others took the bread with trembling hands. "Forgive us," one whispered, though he didn't say for what. The enemy didn't let them rest for long. 3 nights after the battle, the Germans struck again, not with tanks this time, but with precision. Mortars fell like rain. The first shell hit near the church, collapsing what remained of its steeple. The second tore through a medical station, scattering litters and supplies. Winters sprinted through the chaos, shouting orders, pulling wounded men to cover. The air was a storm of dust and screams. Lipton found him crouched behind a wall, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "We can't take another hit like this," Lipton shouted. Winters nodded grimly. "Then we move." Under fire, they shifted their defense line to the western edge of town, using what buildings still stood as cover. It was instinct now, no fear, only motion. By dawn, the shelling stopped, leaving silence thick as smoke. The men emerged from the debris like miners from the earth, coughing, bloodied, alive. When the sun rose, Carrington looked unrecognizable. The air shimmered with heat from smoldering wreckage. The town square, once a battlefield, was now a graveyard. Winters stood there in the morning light, staring at the faces of civilians sweeping the streets with quiet determination. A young French girl approached, barefoot and dirt-streaked, holding a wilted flower. She extended it to him without a word. He took it gently, his hands trembling. "Mercy," he said, his voice cracking. She smiled faintly before running off. It was a small moment, fragile and perfect. A reminder that even in ruin, life found a way to return. That afternoon, orders came down from Colonel Sink. The 101st was to push south toward the Perrier Road, to secure the approaches for advancing armor. There was no rest. Winters gathered his men in what remained of the town square. "We move at dusk," he said. "This isn't over yet. The enemy's retreating, but they'll fight every inch of ground." Malarkey groaned softly. "We just took this place. Now we're leaving it?" Winters nodded. "That's war." As they prepared to move, the townspeople lined the streets, watching in silence. Some saluted, others prayed. One old man removed his hat and whispered, "Vive la liberté." The men of Easy Company didn't look back. They marched out of Carentan the same way they'd arrived, quietly, carrying their brothers' memories like unseen banners. The march south was punishing. The Normandy sun beat down, the air thick with the smell of churned soil and death. They passed fields littered with wreckage, burned-out panzers, horses lying twisted in harnesses, parachutes tangled in hedges like ghosts of the invasion. Every step seemed to echo with the sound of those who hadn't made it. Winters walked at the head of the column, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind somewhere far away, perhaps at home, perhaps still in the smoke of Carentan. At a crossroads, they halted to rest. A farmer approached with a cart of water. He looked at them, these filthy, hollow-eyed men, and said in broken English, "Thank you." "For my son." Winters nodded, unable to speak. Some debts, he thought, could never be repaid, only remembered. That night they bivouacked in an orchard, the moonlight silver on their helmets. The air smelled of apples and gun oil. The men sat in small groups, cleaning rifles, sharing what rations remained. Someone hummed a tune, something soft and slow. "Maybe I'll be seeing you." Lipton looked around at them, so young, so worn, and thought how impossible it was that they were still standing. He caught Winters staring into the distance. "You all right, sir?" he asked. Winters nodded. "Just thinking. About what? How close we came to not being here." Lipton smiled faintly. "Yeah, but we are." The two men sat in silence for a while, listening to the rustle of the wind through the leaves. The world felt fragile again, suspended between peace and chaos. In the following days, the 101st linked up with armored units advancing inland. The line moved forward, the front stretching toward St. Lo. Reports came that the Allies had broken through at the beaches, the invasion secure. When Winters finally received the official confirmation, he read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Around him the men cheered, weary, half-hearted, but genuine. For the first time in weeks, the sound of joy rose above the noise of war. They had done it. The lost paratroopers who landed in the wrong town had not only survived, they had become the pivot upon which the campaign turned. But history, Winters knew, was never written in clean lines. That night, as the men celebrated with captured wine and laughter that sounded almost normal, he wandered away to the edge of the field. The sky above was vast and filled with stars. He sat on a fallen tree, the flower from the French girl still tucked in his breast pocket. He thought of the men buried outside Carentan, of Wynne, Guarnere, Toy, and so many others. He remembered their faces, their jokes, their quiet courage. "We were just kids," he whispered to the night, and we held the line. When dawn came again, soft and gold through the mist, Easy Company moved out once more, toward new towns, new battles, new histories to carve into the bones of Europe. They left behind the ruins of Carentan, but not the bond that had been forged there. That bond would outlast the war itself, carried in memories, photographs, and the quiet moments between battles when men looked at one another and saw not soldiers, but brothers. Years later, when the guns were silent and the uniforms put away, those who survived would sometimes return, gray-haired now, slower, gentler. They would walk the cobbled streets of Carentan, where children played again, where laughter had returned to the air. They would stand before the church rebuilt stone by stone and remember the sound of its bell falling. They would touch the names carved into the memorial, the ones who never came home, and feel again the heat of that June sun, the roar of battle, the trembling silence after victory. And if anyone asked them how they had done it, how a handful of paratroopers cut off in the wrong town had turned the tide of an invasion, they would smile, eyes distant, and say simply, "We just held on," because that's what the 101st did. They held when they were lost, they fought when they were surrounded, and they won when no one believed they could. In the mud of Normandy, amid the ruins of Carentan, they proved that courage isn't found in orders or maps or medals. It's found in men who refuse to let go of each other, even when the world is falling apart. And so, when the history books tell of D-Day, of beaches stormed and flags raised, and somewhere, quietly between the lines, there will always be the story of those who landed in the wrong town and never left it behind.